So Trevor, let's get into part three of our breakdown today, and we're going to look at take a little bit of a deeper dive into Texas A&M, and this is the fun part for me. This is because now this isn't about recruiting rankings or stats. This is about personnel and scheme. And when you look at Texas A&M, I have two main thoughts about this team. Number one is I don't believe this team right now today is as good as people think that it is. We'll find out if I'm right or wrong on Saturday night, right, to a degree. It's a good team, but it's not what some people make it out to be. It's not a team that should be a home favorite over a team like Notre Dame. If you were playing NC State, who's only ranked like 2 spots behind Notre Dame, the odds are pretty good that Notre Dame's not favored to lose that game, although I could look at last year's Notre Dame-NC State game and see what the spread was. I'd be curious what the spread was in that game last year. But the point is they are, and we're going to see how it's played out. I don't think they're quite – Notre Dame was a 7.5-point road favorite over NC State last year, who, by the way, was a 9-win team last season. But different conversation for a different day. The point is this is what the perception is, but what I will also say is if I'm looking at this as a national analyst, take just the Notre Dame game out of this. I'm excited for the future of Texas A&M football with the arrival of Mike Oko. I am, because he can recruit. So you're not going to have a problem recruiting top players. He'll get top players, but he's a great evaluator of talent. So there's going to be times A&M says, no, we don't want that guy that Rivals or 247 or On 3 thinks is a 5-star, because I want this kid over here who's not in the top 300 because I know how to evaluate players. Kind of like when he went and brought in Jeremiah Wusu-Koramoah to Notre Dame, who he was recruiting at Wake. And he's like, no, we need to bring that guy to Notre Dame. Right? He's a great evaluator of talent, in my opinion. He hired a very good staff. Love his D-line hire of Sean Spencer. Love his offensive coordinator hire of Colin Klein. He brought his O-line coach from Duke, who did a really nice job building a really good O-line at Duke last year with not a lot of talent outside of Graham Barton. And, he put a good staff. I have some questions. Jay Bateman is the D coordinator, but at the end of the day, this is Mike Oko's defense, right? The future of Texas A&M, Trevor, with the arrival of Mike Oko is very bright. And we're going to dive into some of the things we like and what they do that are going to kind of play into this. But I really, really like this hire. And I think the future of Texas A&M football is as bright as it's been in a long – they've had some mediocre coaching hires in the last 20 years. In my opinion, this is my opinion, I think this is the best hire they've made since R.C. Slocum left. I truly believe that. Truly believe that. The whole – 1 10+ win season in 20 years. In the next 5 years, I'd be willing to bet you $1,000 that in the next 5 years, Mike Elko is going to have more 10+ win seasons in 5 years than A&M's had in the last 20. Like, I wholeheartedly believe that. I have that kind of faith in Mike Elko and what he's going to bring. I just don't know that we should expect that to happen game one. That's the only thing I would say.
The thing that I love the most about Mike Elko is you can almost track, and not almost, you can go back and track that a lot of the programs that he is spending his time in and being a part of get increasingly better with his arrival.
And usually pretty quickly.
Right. Really quickly. Look at the Notre Dame defense turnaround from 16 to 17. Right? And then he goes and he becomes the defensive coordinator for Texas A&M under Jimbo Fisher, which was the last time that Texas A&M was really a threat in the SEC, right? And then Elko left. Look what happened. Then look what he did at Duke. They were a 9-25, 10-25 team before. Yep, 10-25 team before Elko came into town. And since then, they turned around the program, and the narrative with them changed. And they started out the year last year upsetting a top 10 ranked team in Clemson at home, which is arguably their biggest win in program history. And he was able to do that after year, I want to say 2. So the places that Mike Elko goes, he has a track record of turning around programs extremely quickly due to the fact that he knows how to attract talent. He knows how to get that talent to come to wherever he's at, because he has a natural eye for it. He did the same thing at Notre Dame.
And the evaluation piece is key. It's so important because it's not just about going out and getting highly ranked guys. It's about getting guys that you believe can play and fit your system. And he has so far been very good at recruiting to his system. He understands, okay, yeah, that guy's a 4-star top 100 player, but he doesn't fit what we do. So I'm going to get that guy that maybe is not ranked as high. That's going to be a better player for us because of what we do. He very much understands the fit part. Like you look at some of these corners they got in the portal, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Not elite players, and not in my opinion, future high round draft picks, but guys that are great fits for what he wants to do defensively. And that's an important part to this whole thing, man. Is it's one thing to be able to get ranked players or talented players, but if you're not getting guys that fit what you do and can thrive specifically in how you run your program, not just schematically, but just how you go about your business every day, it's going to be hard for you to go out and really maximize your success as a program. And that's something that Mike Elko has done a great job of, and why I think that the future at Texas A&M is very bright. Let's first dive into the offense, though, Trevor, and we're going to talk about the move he made there, because I think one of the most important things that a head coach can do is what moves do you make on the side of the ball that's not your specialty. And it's interesting, but the guy that he hired to run his offense is a guy that Notre Dame interviewed and liked a lot when they were looking to hire a new coordinator in 2022 or 2023, following the 2022 season. That's Colin Klein from Kansas State. And when you're talking about this Texas A&M offense, we'll get into the personnel and all those type of things, but I believe that Colin Klein was a strong hire. My only question will be, how quickly can they adapt to what he wants to do? But just looking big picture, kind of taking the 1,000 foot view of the whole thing, looking at this long term, because this hire is meant to be a long term. You're going to build this thing over time, not necessarily for game one, but where are you in game 100? I think this is a really strong hire. One, if not for Mike Denbrock getting hired at Notre Dame and Chip Kelly getting hired at Ohio State, which were kind of the big newsy type of hires, this, outside of those two, this might be the best offensive coordinator hire that was made outside of those two in all of college football this past hiring cycle. I really think that highly of Colin Klein from what we've seen at Kansas State.
I really like the Colin Klein hire. He reminds me a lot of what Todd Monken did for Georgia, using multiple tight end sets and a lot of pre-snap motion, which I know we'll dive into. But I, very similar to you, I evaluate like how when Marcus Freeman and Notre Dame brought in Mike Denbrock to take over the offense, it's not a miracle to say if you're a defensive-minded head coach, the defense is going to be good. I would hope so. That's where all of your background knowledge is, and that's what you have the most experience in. So I think if you are a defensive-minded head coach, or on the flip side, an offensive-minded head coach, you need to be able to get somebody that balances out your expertise. And I think Mike Elko found a guy like that in Colin Klein. Because if you don't, on either side, you have your situations like Lincoln Riley's a genius offensive mind, and every Lincoln Riley coach team, the defense isn't that great, because you got to get the people in the position to help the other side of the ball be successful. And I think Colin Klein's going to be able to do that for Texas A&M.
The interesting thing is, Trevor, is he was at Kansas State for a while. He obviously finished his career in 2012, spent a year kind of bouncing around trying to play professional football, quickly realized he was not a professional football player, and he was not. So he comes to Kansas State, spends 2 years as a GA, then spends 1 year at Northern Iowa, and then he came back to Kansas State, and he's been there ever since. He was there in 2017 as their quarterbacks coach, and basically had that role until 2022 when he was named the offensive coordinator and the quarterbacks coach at Kansas State. And you look at the results. I like looking at what did guys do compared to where they were before. And when you look at his first year at Kansas State as a position coach, they averaged 32.3 points per game. And then after that, it was 22.5, 29.6, 26.6, 27.5. He gets promoted to offensive coordinator for 2022. They jump up to 32.3. And then in his second season there, they jump up to 37.1. And when they lost games last year, they lost game 27-30 to Missouri. At Missouri, they lost 21-29 at Oklahoma State, 30-33 at Texas, and then 35-42 against Iowa State. They weren't exactly losing games last year because their offense couldn't move the ball in big moments, you know what I mean, against good teams. They lost because their defense wasn't as good as they needed to be in some of those games. But you see an immediate jump in what they did offensively when it was his time to kind of take over and run that offense. And I think that matters. If you look at some other peripheral numbers so his last 3 years as just a position coach, K-State averaged 358.9 yards per game, 5.6 yards per play. The next year they were at 337.4 yards per game, 5.6 yards per play, and then 361.9 yards per game, and then 6.3 yards per play. Jump up to him being in charge. It goes 418.8 yards per game and 6.1 yards per play. So up in yards, slightly down in yards per play. And then they jump up this past year to 445.2 yards per play, per game, 6.0 yards per play. So other than 1 year, much better in a total yards per play and total offense standpoint with him in charge. I mean, noticeable just like that. Now, you had some good players there, but they were doing this with Adrian Martinez and Will Howard at quarterback, who I don't think either one of them are world beaters. They did have a great player in Deuce Vaughn a couple of years ago, but one of the things that I like about Colin Klein is he goes out and loses Deuce Vaughn, who had 1,558 yards in 2022, and loses Adrian Martinez, who rushed for over 600 yards and had 10 touchdowns. Comes out this past year, and their rushing per game average only went down 4 yards. And their yards per play average only went down 0.1. DJ Giddens slides right into it. Trayshawn Ward transferred from Florida State. He's a nice number 2 back. Will Howard's not the runner that Adrian Martinez is, but they used him effectively. I think their first touchdown against Missouri was a read zone from like the 7-yard line where he just read it and they crashed and he jumps out, right? And then they were able to kind of incorporate Avery Johnson into sort of like a role that Tyler Buckner had for Notre Dame in 2021, where he just kind of came in and ran the ball. And so to be able to lose a stud like Deuce Vaughn and then just kind of not miss a beat, score more points, have more yards, still run the football just as effectively, to me, says a lot about what kind of coach he is and the success he's had at Kansas State so far.
Very similar to the other side of the ball, where Mike Elko does a great job at finding players that fit the scheme and to execute well. Colin Klein does a really good job at doing that at Kansas State as well. He's able to what he was able to do for Kansas State was get them to a point where they just had to reload. Minor tweaks to how it was because Will Howard is not as talented of a runner. They were losing out on Deuce Vaughn, so minor tweaks had to be made. But he, being Colin Klein, is a very, I call him like a scheme demon. He does a really good job of creating space for his players to go out and navigate and make plays in space. It's great.
I think the state of Kansas, had 2 of the best coaches in college football last year at creating running lanes for their backs.
Yep.
And the guy, Chris Kudelnicki, who's at Penn State, and now Colin Klein, who's now at Texas A&M. They both had over 200 yards a game last year. And both did a very good job of using a lot of different things to get the run game going because they don't always have the biggest and baddest and most talented offensive line. So what are some ways that Colin Klein does that? There's really 3 things that I think are key to his run game. Number 1, and this is going to be very fascinating when looking at this Notre Dame matchup. Number 1 is, and you talked about this when you and I were talking before the show started, Trevor, very good use of 12 personnel. And even in 11 personnel, moving the tight ends in position to create extra gaps and to try to give you extra surfaces that you have to account for as a defense. That's number 1. And then combining that with really good use of quick and sudden pre-snap movements, jet motions, orbit motions, things along those lines. And then the ball doesn't always go where you think it's going to go based on the action of the backs and the linemen. Combine those 3 things together and you understand why they've been a very good running team, even though they haven't had elite talent the way that he'll have at Texas A&M the next few years, for example.
And all the motion that they put in their offense is intentional, which I'm a big fan of. I don't like when teams just send a slot receiver in motion, kind of jogs by, the offensive line. If you're going to go by that slow, just line up there. But no, he does a really good job of running out of 12 personnel, which is why I said that's very similar to what Todd Monken did at Georgia. Now, Georgia is known for having those hosses up on front, which I understand, but it's a similar concept, which I'm a big fan of. To your point, they didn't have world beaters at the offensive line position like Notre Dame teams in the past.
Cooper Beebe's a really good player. I mean, they had some,
Yeah,
but they're not trotting out Quentin Nelson and Ronnie Stanley and Mike McGlinchey and Aaron Banks and Joe Walt and guys like that for sure.
100%. And he did a great job at utilizing the personnel that he had, because you have to be able to run the football, and that was a key principle of his offensive scheme, and he was able to find creative ways to do it.
This is also why Notre Dame tried to hire him 2 years ago to be the offensive coordinator. It's because Marcus Freeman's a guy that likes to run the football. And this is one of the more creative offensive minds in the game. I mean, there's no surprise that his top 2 picks for OC that year were Colin Klein and Andy Ludwig, 2 guys that have very creative run the football teams, right? Because he understands as a defensive coordinator how challenging it can be to defend all those extra surfaces and the motions and the shifts and the misdirection and things like that, specific into the run game, a lot of inside zone, but also a nice mix of pin and pull stuff. They'll do quick wraps with their backside guards and tackles. They'll do straight pin and pull outside stuff, toss, like toss crack, toss sweep, buck sweep, things like that. They'll run a lot of read zone, where if you try to crash too hard on the backside, get a lot of extra surfaces front side, protect the backside with your quarterback, especially in the red zone. That's why Will Howard only had like 300 some rushing yards last year, but had 9 rushing touchdowns, because they love to run the read zone in the red zone. A very creative run game too, that you just can't pin your ears back and crash, downhill in the A and B gaps and shut down their run game, because they'll get some of those balls outside of you. And if you're not disciplined at the linebacker, and I'll say this, they put a lot of stress on the linebackers in the secondary in the run game with the way that they get at, because sometimes they'll just kind of take the linebackers out a little bit with just the surfaces and then this blocking scheme and say, you're going to have to get your DBs downhill and stop us on this particular play.
It puts a lot of stress on linebackers, defensive ends having to trust their eyes a little bit, because there's so much happening before the play. They'll send a slot receiver in an orbit motion, and then you'll have running back lined up on left side, and, you're reading backside defensive end on a read pull, right? And so it puts a lot of very aggressive defenses almost at a handicap. And I don't want to call it like a triple option team, but there's a lot that is thrown at you pre-snap that you have to be ready for, not just one certain thing. They're not good at running the ball because they lined up in, the I formation and they're in 22 personnel and that it's coming. That's not what made them so good at running the football. But Colin Klein would have been a great fit at Notre Dame after Tommy Rees left, with, Notre Dame being a very much a 12 personnel team and our ability to run the ball. I mean, you give Colin Klein a running back like Audric Estime, I mean, he's having a field day. So it's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out with Texas A&M. So,
what I'm glad we didn't have to see is Sam Hartman trying to run Colin Klein's offense. That would not have gone as well as hoped for, but it would have been fun to watch Riley Leonard, for example, run this kind of offense. And I'm very curious to see how Connor Wegman's going to fit into this offense.
Yep.
Because I actually thought Connor Wegman ran the ball well in high school. He's not a runner, but he can run. I see him being very much in the Will Howard type of quarterback in this offense. They didn't do a lot of that with him last year at A&M, but I think he can do it. Now, I don't know what kind of work they've put into getting him into the run game in this offseason, but I'll be shocked if they're not doing some of the same things with him that they did with Will Howard last year. It wasn't complicated. They weren't running a lot of power read with Will Howard. It was a lot of read zone stuff, quarterback draw stuff, where you got a good athlete who has, can read a defense and then make a decision and pull the ball and run and gain 12, 15 yards and then just go down. I think that Notre Dame will need to be prepared for that. Absolutely be prepared for having – this isn't going to be last year's A&M offense. And it's also not going to be what it was with Adrian Martinez or what it was when Avery Johnson was in the game last year. It's going to look a lot like, in my opinion, run game-wise, what they had when Will Howard was in the game. Not a dangerous running threat, but you have to be aware of it, because if you don't respect that backside pull option, he'll pull it and there's nobody there and he runs for 12 yards. Easiest 12 yards pick up in your life. Have to account for those type of plays in this offense.
Yeah. I don't Will Howard is definitely a guy that if you need 7 yards, he'll get you 10. If you need 20 yards, he'll get you 10, with that style of offense. And I don't think Connor Wegman is known as a dual threat guy. He's no Riley Leonard athletically by any means. But one advantage that I do think that Notre Dame's defense has is they just got done watching this with a more athletic quarterback all offseason, which I think is going to pay a lot of dividends on Saturday. But no, I do think that they need to be prepared for a little bit of that backside zone read where Wegman could pull it. I mean, I think it'll come into play in the red zone because that's when Colin Klein is the most comfortable calling that. And I think it also down and distance situations. Third down, third and short, you can see it. I think those are two down and distance scenarios where I think that you have to be wary of the quarterback's feet, regardless of if he's a world beater and a world-class track athlete or not.
Going to see a lot of RPOs in this offense as well.
Yep.
A lot of stuff where they're going to try to hit those quick slants, glance routes, seam routes. They're going to hit the backside of the backfield a lot. Check downs, wheel routes, angle routes, things along those lines. You're going to see some of that stuff out of this backfield. They're going to throw to the tight ends more so in some of the play action, bootleg type of stuff. They didn't really throw the tight ends a ton in regard to like down the field until really last year. They did a little bit more of that last year with Ben Sinnott, but prior to that, it was more, hit those the overs, the crossers, the slide stuff. But last year, their best weapon in the pass game was their tight end. So again, there's an adaptation to what they do in the pass game, but a lot of bootleg stuff, a lot of motion stuff, a lot of RPO stuff, and they don't run a ton of pure drop back, or at least they haven't. A lot of their pass game is built off their run action, which is why if you can shut down their run game early, you have the chance to have some success. Because I do think a lot of what they do in the Colin Klein, I don't believe, is a quarterback coach or an offensive coordinator that wants to just drop back and throw the ball 25 times out of pure drops. If he's going to throw the ball 30, 35 times, you're going to have maybe 10 pure drops. Rest is going to be RPO, quick game, movement stuff, play action stuff, RPO stuff, which can make it a little bit harder to kind of get to the quarterback in some of those instances. But that's something where Notre Dame is going to have to be prepared to handle and play with a lot of stuff. Like last year, Kansas State only gave up 17 sacks all year. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the ball just kind of gets out kind of quick. And if you can jump some of that stuff early, like Missouri did a pretty good job of this at times, they would take away the quick stuff and allow that blitz to get up the middle and get him on Will Howard on his heels. And then he would make mistakes. He had some incompletions. He threw an early pick on that kind of play where he sails a little check down to the running back, gets picked off. So I think those are things where I'll say this. He's more creative, in my opinion, with the run game than he is with the pass game. The pass game is a complement to what they want to do running the football, in my opinion. Now, it doesn't mean there's not some good stuff there, but it's really centers around what they do with their movement and their run game. If their run game struggles, their pass game can struggle against good defenses, in my opinion. And that's going to be a key for Notre Dame is force them to be more reliant on their passing game.
Colin Klein's a coordinator that absolutely likes to take calculated risks. He wants to maximize how efficient his offense can be, which is why they got the ball out so quickly last year. Giving up 17 sacks in the season is pretty good for being a school that's not known for having 5 hogs up front at the offensive line, right? I think that, how he tailors his offense, getting his playmakers into space, that's what makes them so successful. But that all starts with running the football. And I think, to your point, if Notre Dame is able to stuff that early and get Connor Wegman and get pressure, which is, I know we'll talk more about this on Thursday in Keys to Victory, pass rush, front seven is going to play a huge role into what happens on Saturday.
Now, I'm interested to see what the personnel at A&M allows him to do throwing the football, because he didn't really have, I don't say the kind of athletes, because he had good athletes. What I mean is more so he didn't have the kind of size that A&M has very often at receiver. A lot of his receivers were 6'1" or shorter. I mean, I'm looking at their top 4 pass catchers last year, top 5 pass catchers last year. 2 of them were 6 foot, one of them 6'1", one was 5'11", one was 5'7", 5'8". I mean, they haven't had a lot of those big guys. Their big guys have been really more so tight ends in a lot of different years. And so they haven't had a ton of those big, tall, vertical guys. 2022, they had a taller kid. Malik Knowles was a little bit of a taller kid. But it's been a lot of the quick, shifty guys, and that this offense needs that. That's why they got Cyrus Allen out of Louisiana Tech. It's that 6 foot kind of guy that can stretch the field, can do stuff after the catch. It's why somebody in the chat just brought up Terry Bussey, who they moved over from the secondary, because he brings a lot of that element, that speed, that after the catch. You know, you want to get guys in space, as you mentioned. They need that. But he also now has some of those big, tall guys on the outside of the passing game. So those 6'6" guys that you can run play action and just throw a backside poke. Doesn't have to get creative. My guy's